All right, good evening, everyone, and welcome to Strait Science. Strait Science is an evening seminar series put on by UAF Northwest Campus here in Nome, as well as UAF Alaska Sea Grant, and the UAF part is University of Alaska Fairbanks. Both UAF Alaska Sea Grant here in Nome and Northwest Campus. We are public servants of the Bering Strait region, which is the homeland and waters of the Inupiaq, St. Lawrence Island Yupik, and Central Yupik peoples. Now, tonight you may have heard us a little bit before talking about all our woes with the ice having broken off in front of Nome, and we're looking at gray water here, which is a little disconcerting in February 19. But we bring good news tonight. We've got Sara Henslee. Sara Henslee is with the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, Region 5, headquartered here in Nome. She is the area wildlife biologist for Game Management Unit 22. And she's got the best news of all, I hope, because while we're all kind of worried about what's going on in the ocean, I've been thinking, what is the cheeriest thing I can think of this winter with this situation of rain in the middle of winter and whatnot? And all I kept thinking was, fat moose. That's my question, and we'll see if fat moose is going to be something in our future or not. So with that, I present Sara Henslee. She is wondrous and will walk us through where we are with our moose in Game Management Unit 22C and 22D. Rock on, Sara.
All right. Well, thanks everybody for tuning in. I don't know how many people are online, but nice
13.
to have our fish and game representation here, and Charlie from our local advisory committee representing. So let's see if I can go. Yes. So I'm gonna, like you said, talk about our moose. I'm gonna focus on the moose in units 22C and D, which I'll show a map of for folks that aren't familiar with our area tuning in remotely. I'll go through some of the research projects that have been done over the last 6 years or so and the results of that, and kind of where we're going to go from there, talk about some conclusions, and then we'll have time for discussion and questions at the end. Oh, I did want to mention this picture. It's one of my favorites because it just shows like a great image of moose in winter habitat in the Cripple River, for those of you who are familiar. So it's like 13 moose and very tiny short willows, which I always find hilarious because you would not guess there would be that many moose in that shrimpy of a willow habitat in the wintertime, but they love it. So starting out with some population history, I'll focus on 22C first, and that is our population closest to Nome. You can see it in the red arrow on the map. And on your left, I've got the population estimate through time. To give you a little bit of history there, moose have not always been on the Seward Peninsula. They have moved into the area, I don't know, as early as the 1940s, we started to get records of that. And then they were starting to become common by the 1960s and considered abundant kind of by the, late 70s into the 80s. So we've got our population graph here. The number of moose are there in the blue line over time from 1985 when they first started counting through the last time we did a survey, which was 2022. So you can see in 22C, we've had kind of a variable population through time. Generally, there wasn't a lot of restrictions on hunting in C, so you can see the population was a little bit lower. And then in the late 90s, we started to get a few more regulations and the population was able to grow. Eventually, it got up to somewhere around 550 moose, and the managers at the time felt that there was some skinny moose. They were worried about winter mortality and felt that maybe 500-600 moose was too many for the Nome area. And then we started a cow harvest in the year 2000, which you can see there. So started harvesting cows, female moose, with the intent to reduce that population. At first, we didn't harvest very many. It was only like 10 or 15 a year. And then you can see kind of getting into the early 2000s, the population continued to grow, even though we were harvesting females. So managers bumped up that female harvest. And you can see after 2000, we kind of hit our limit, that 660 moose and started to decline when that cow harvest did seem to make an impact on lowering the population. And today we have somewhere around 400-ish moose as of our last population estimate. So 22C, kind of the takeaway here is we're not really sure what that population can hold, how many moose there should be in the Nome area, but we are worried about kind of winter habitat there. So trying to keep it at a lower amount, which our population goal is currently 450 to 525 moose in 22C. Moving on to the north, we've got 22D, that's that Coosatrin area, American River and Neapoc for those who are familiar. This is a little bit different of a story. 22D is a larger area. It's got those bigger rivers like Coosatrin and American, a little more contiguous habitat and places for moose to go in the winter when the snow gets deep. So with the history with that population, you can see it's always been kind of around 1,500 moose, but we had that spike in the late 1980s when we almost got up to 3,000 moose basically. During that time, there was a lot of reports of dying adult moose, skinny moose, and consequently, the next time they were able to get out in the area after some severe winters in the late 80s and 90s, the population had declined substantially down to 1,600. So in the 80s, it seemed like a lot of folks still tell me today you could ride across the Coosatrin on the backs of moose. And that really isn't the case compared to what we see today when it's gone back to that lower amount of about 1,500 moose and kind of stayed at that amount. So 22D seems to be a little more stable compared to C. You saw those numbers jump through time, but we still have a lot of questions about how many moose can exist in either of these areas. Today, our management goal is to increase the population to 2,000 to 2,500 moose. So we're staying a little bit below that 3,000 is the plan, and that is our best guess at how many moose can exist in 22D. So two different stories. In C, we're kind of keeping them at a lower amount. D, we want to see a few more. So a lot of questions, like I was saying, is winter habitat. That is kind of what restricts moose in our country, just because there is so little willow areas for them to go to. Once the snow gets deep, they move into these rivers and creeks, which are very limited in 22C especially, and then a little less so in D. But a lot of questions about what our winter habitat looks like and if it is good to have 2,000 moose in the 22D area, and should we have as many as 500 moose in C? Should we have more? Just a lot of uncertainty. So that kind of inspired the research projects that we started in 2018. So yeah, here's an example of 22D. That's the Coosatrin River. Very extensive habitat in the summertime, lots of willows, lots of green. Not so much a problem, but then in the winter, this is a picture of Snake River and C. You can see the willow habitat, those brown patches in that picture are very limited. And as the snow gets deep, moose are moving down into the rivers where it's just hungry country when you're fighting for a little bit of willows with a lot of moose in the area. So we have two questions that were kind of the groundwork for this research project. The first being our question of if the moose population in this area is limited by nutrition. And if you don't know what nutrition is, I'll talk about that more and explain it better in a second. And then secondly, if the population is limited by predation. So mortality, whether it be by calves or adults, we were going to look into these two questions. First, I'll start with this question of nutrition. And just to kind of explain what nutrition is, it's kind of just another word for health. So I wanted to line out what a healthy moose population looks like first. So we've got 4 indices of moose population health that moose managers like myself use when we're trying to decide how the population's doing as a whole. So first off, we look at habitat, and specifically we look at the browse removal in the winter time. Here's a picture of typical winter moose habitat. I talked a little bit about it in the previous slide about how in the winter moose get restricted to this very limited habitat. So we really want to make sure that these willows are not getting overbrowsed by moose so extensively that the willows are starting to die. And when there's a lot of heavy browsing pressure by moose, it will negatively impact willows. And I've got a couple of photos here of what that looks like. First off, this one might be hard to see for folks with on screens, but you can see where the moose have kind of broken the trees so that they can get to those taller browse and the twigs up high. Moose will actually walk over trees to break it, and then they can eat the little buds at the end. Because in the wintertime, moose are just eating that woody vegetation, whereas in the summer, they're eating leaves, horsetails, forbs, anything they can get onto. So this is an example of a deeper snow year when moose were having a hard time getting around, and they had to walk over these branches and break them so they could get to the younger browse. Here's another example in a higher browse willow. This is what's called brooming. So you can see where moose have put so much pressure eating the twigs in this willow that it's actually completely changed the structure of that willow, where the twigs are very, very tiny, and each original kind of stem will create up to, gosh, like 30 individual twigs that are very small and not very nutritious for moose. So it is interesting. That one is very broomed, but you can see in the background there's not very many. The willows look fine. They don't look as broomed. So it seems like they just really liked this willow for some reason. Secondly, we'll look at the age to maturity for our female moose. So this is when they begin to produce calves. And a lot of other populations that have higher densities of moose and are unhealthy, comparatively, you might not see them start producing moose calves until they're 4 or 5 years old. And in a healthier population, they can begin calving very early. In fact, they can get pregnant when they're yearlings, and we can see calving at 2 years old. Another thing is calf weight, and here's an example of the research staff Warren when he was here measuring the calf weight of a young moose, and we'll collect this in the springtime before the moose becomes 1 year of age. So basically how to do that, we will go out and dart the moose with what's called a chemical immobilin, and then we'll weigh them with this, it's kind of like a blanket and spring scale program to get the weight, and then we'll measure as many moose as we can get our hands on and get the average weights there to give us a comparison. As well as the body condition, you'll see a lot of like bones sticking out in unhealthy moose. You can see their hip bones, their ribs, whereas healthier moose are going to weigh a lot heavier comparatively, and you won't be able to see their ribs or their hips as much. Finally, we'll look at twinning rates. So moose are able to produce 2 calves versus 1. And in healthier populations, you'll see a lot more twins versus the single calf. So we'll get out in the springtime. It's the last week of May when moose produce their calves. And then we'll go count as many moose as we can that have calves, and we'll compare the ones that had 1 versus the one that had 2 to get this measure of twinning rate. So these are kind of the 4 things that we'll look into for this research project and looking into this question of health and nutrition for the population. Again, like I was saying, we had this sample of collared calves that Warren put out. For those of you that live locally, you've probably seen these calves. They're adults now, but they've got these white collars and then yellow flags so that we can identify them when we're flying in a plane. And then all of the moose will have individually unique ear tags as well. So it's a different color depending on what year they were collared. And then the number identifies them as an individual. So if you ever see this out there, we love to get pictures of ear tagged moose. We love to know where they are. Sometimes the collars have fallen off, so we're just not sure that they're even alive still. So it's always nice to get reports if you ever do see ear tagged moose. And then from those collared calves, each of them will have a unique frequency. So we can go out in this Super Cub style airplane. which will let us decode every unique frequency from the plane, and we can actually track each moose from the air to right overhead. So we'll do these calving surveys in the springtime, and we'll go look at every single moose that has a collar to see how many of them have calves, and if they do have calves, how many, whether it's one or twins. Finally, we did browse surveys. So here's Alicia doing a browse survey on a moderately browsed bush and measuring the thickness of the twigs, which is just the fancy way of us getting an estimate of how healthy the moose population is through that browse removal rate. So we did browse surveys in 2020 and then last year in 2024 in 22C. So moving on to the results from this project, I'll start with the spring calf weight. So just to put into reference what we're looking for here, the index set out for moose managers is to look for calves that weigh on average 385 pounds or more. So on this axis here, we've got the y-axis of the average spring calf weight and then the year. So we did 4 years of calf captures and we're gonna see how much they weighed here. So as you can see, that circle for each of these years is the average weight. And each time we're above the dotted line. So the moose are doing really well. The calves seem to be pretty fat from the years we did the survey. So on average, the weight was 401 pounds in 22C and D from the 110 moose that we were able to get these weights for. So that's pretty good. We're above that index of that nutritional unhealthy level of 385 pounds. Next, we'll look at the twinning rate. So again, the metric to beat is 10% twinning rate or less. So we want more than 10% to know if our moose are healthy. On the twinning, on the y-axis here, we've got the percent twins compared to the ones with single calves. So our average, once again, is really high. We've got an average of 60% over the 4 years of the project on our collared cows. So well above that metric of 10%. So that was really nice to see. And then also for the age of maturity, so when these moose start calving, the metric to beat here is when less than 50% of your 3-year-olds have calves. We want more. And what we found is that 79% of our 3-year-olds had calves, and they were actually twinning at 3 years old. So we ended up seeing a lot of 2-year-olds that began producing calves. About a fourth of them began calving, and then we had a twinning rate at 3. So we're doing really well in comparison to that 10% and the 3-year-old maturity. Finally, browse removal. In a healthy browse removal, in a healthy moose population, you really want to see less than 35% browse removed from your willows on average. In 2020 and 22D, we found a removal rate of 11%. And in 22C, we found a removal rate of 9%. So those are a couple examples of 22C. This is the El Dorado River. That was the heaviest browsed area that we could find, but overall, it did not seem like the willows were terribly browsed. And yeah, that overall rate of 9% is very low. So looking at great numbers so far for all of those 4 metrics. And now I just wanted to quickly summarize what all of that looked like so you can see it in one place. So again, that Borchi et al. Is just the metrics of a healthy population. So we've got less than or equal to 10% of twinning rates. The 3-year-old parturition or calving rate is less than 50%. If you're short yearlings, those calves at the springtime are less than 385 pounds. And then the browse removal rate, if it's greater than 35%, that's an unhealthy population. And like I was saying, we have not seen any of that. We've got really high twinning rates, great calving rates among our 3-year-olds and twinning among our 3-year-olds. The calf weights are well above that 385 pounds, and we have really low browse removal. So what does all of this mean? It means I, as the manager, am giving the population a gold star. The population is not nutritionally limited from what I can tell, and it is generally a healthy population, really good reproduction calving rates, and they are trying to produce as many moose as they can. So that's really nice to see. Second, we wanted to answer that question of predation, if that's limiting our population. So this is now involving the collaring of newborn calves as well as those moose calves that I was talking about before. So here our objectives were just to describe calf mortality in the same area, and we've already got the adults collared, so we'll look at the adult mortality there. And from all of this data combined with our reproduction and our survival rates, we'll be able to estimate if the population is growing or stable. So as far as data collection, we've already gotten the reproductive rates in the collared moose that are adults, like I said. But now we're going to collar those neonate moose, which just means newborn. So these are the neonates of the collared adult females. So then we could compare the health of the neonates, the calves, with the health of the mother, since we had the collared and the information on her as well. So we did that in 2022 and 2023. It's about 146 calves in total, so a pretty decent size of moose to follow. And we were going to see how they did through their first year of life. And you can see that collar is actually an ACE bandage that we wrapped with the transmitter inside. So pretty quick process. Once we would have the super cub looking for calves in the springtime, and then we would come in the helicopter once the super cub confirmed there were calves, and we would go in, and this is my colleague helping me capture moose. We would go in, throw the ACE bandage collar on really quickly, get a weight for that calf, and then pretty much leave them alone once we knew they were male or female. So the whole process coming in took less than 2 minutes to handle and leave them alone. So pretty quick thing to follow these calves. Yeah, see, mom was, they stayed away with the helicopter. So then the mortality monitoring, again, I was mentioning the frequency, we were able to actually get a mortality signal from those collars. If the moose, whether it's an adult or a calf, hasn't moved in a number of hours, it'll start beeping faster, and that will let us know that the moose has stopped moving and presumably has died. So we'll do every single day after we put the collars out, we'll go back and we will look and hear those beeps, all 100 of them, and wait and see who dies, and immediately try to get out in the helicopter to see what happened to that moose, since it doesn't take very long for that collar, the moose calf, to be eaten if it was a predator. Here's an example of brown bear mortality, or a couple examples. Normally what we'll find when a brown bear has eaten a calf is what looks like just a jumble of grass piled on top of the moose. When they're newborn, there's not a lot of meat, so usually the bear will eat the thing whole, but sometimes once they're a little bit bigger, the moose will the bear will cache it to save it for later. So when we come in the helicopter, usually the bear runs away and you find this cache and know it was the bear. Here's another example on the bottom right. The second year of our study, there was a lot more snow later in the season, so we were able to find the calves and bear tracks with the calf carcass and the collar, which helped us identify that that was a bear mortality as well. This is an example of what drowning looks like. So that year, again, it was a late spring. There was a lot of ice, and then as springtime kind of things warmed up, the water was settling on top of ice. And we think what happened is the moose tried to get her calf to cross a pond. The calf couldn't get traction on that ice under the water and eventually just drowned. So when we did come up on it, the moose are great mothers, and they will stay with their calf as long as they can. So even though this calf was dead, the mom would not move off of this one. So it was difficult to retrieve, but we could confirm that it was drowning here. And then finally, I have an example of natural abandonment. This calf was a twin, actually. And when we went in on the captures, Alicia was with me, and we noticed that this calf was half the size of its twin, which is pretty unusual. And it only weighed about 8 kilograms, which is like 15, 20 pounds, not very heavy for a moose calf. And we also noticed it had this weird bruising on its leg, which it just seemed like it was a smaller calf with this weird mark on it. So we would go back the next day to check on them again, and it looked like she had reunited with mom. But then when we came a few days later, we found she had died and kind of just laid down. So we confirmed that this was kind of a natural abandonment, probably because it was a weaker calf and mom just couldn't take care of them both. So that's kind of a few examples of the neonate mortality. And then for the adults, I have a few examples of what that looks like. So here's the brown bears on an adult. This actually, we were coming in to find the calves of this adult that had died. And while we were looking, radio tracking from the helicopter for the calves, we found this, and obviously the cache was way too big for calves that were a few days old, and the bear was on top of this one. So our best guess is that she was defending her calves a little bit too. She wasted all of her energy defending the calves, and eventually the bear got her too. And then another example of natural mortality. This one we found actually in the springtime. This moose had suddenly decided to walk into the middle of the Kigs, which if you guys have ever been up there, there's no willows. If you can see on the picture, there's no willows. So I don't know what she was doing up there. Usually right before moose will have their calves. They like to do really large movements, but not generally into the Sawtooth Mountains. And it seems weird that she would go here, but she did. So we radio tracked in on her here, and you probably can't really see from this photo, so I zoomed in. This is her that it appeared that she had actually gotten buried in what looks like a snowslide avalanche, and we were able to get to her after that had thawed out a little bit, but she had gotten buried in an avalanche, which is a pretty unique way for a moose to perish in these parts. Which we will see. So a couple examples of what mortality looks like, and now I'll move on to that calf survival. So this is specifically looking at from birth through the first year of life here. And this just kind of shows you the timing of mortality for those calves. What we ended up finding is 18% survival of all of our calves from birth to at least 1 year old. And you can see there's this really steep mortality through the first 45 days or this first 6 weeks of life, which is pretty consistent with other studies, but the 18% survival is very low compared to other places in the state. The most close thing I could find in other studies about calves was about 20% in the Yukon area. But ours is definitely among the lower calf survivals. But the good news is once you get past that 45 days, you're pretty much in the clear. So it's a hard time for a calf that first 6 weeks, but once you're past the 6 weeks, the mortality pretty much disappeared after that point. And then as far as the cause of mortality, everybody probably could have guessed it was brown bears in our area. Of our 119 calves that died, 94 of them were attributed to brown bears, so that's about 79%. And then other mortality includes anything from drowning, the capture related, unknown predator, natural abandonment like I talked about, and then some sort of birth defect. In this case, I think I mentioned umbilical infection. So brown bears, by and large, the main cause of mortality for moose calves in our Unit 22C and D. For the adult survival, we see a much higher survival rate. Like you saw on the graph a couple slides before, once those calves hit 6 weeks, their survival through a year was pretty good. And that trend kind of continues through the rest of their life, really. So we've got the timing here, but I was able to break it down by kind of the age structure. Our yearling survival from year 1 to year 2 was 92%. Young adult survival, so 2 and 3 year olds, was 94%. And then once you're about 4 years old or older, the very low mortality, so 98% survival total. So really good adult survival compared to a lot of other studies. So it seems like if you're a moose and you can survive 6 weeks, you are just good to go in Unit 22C and D, but you got to get past that 6 weeks first. So
And watch out for moose.
watch
Watch out for bears.
Yep.
Yeah, watch out for bears.
Yeah, for sure. And then the cause of mortality on our adults here. So like I said, there's 32 mortality events, a lot fewer compared to the 100 or so calves that we looked at. And from that, about half of those were brown bears, followed by anything from wolf, natural mortality, and starvation. So much lower numbers of mortality, but brown bear is still a heavy hitter for adults too. And usually what we see, especially with that yearlings where you saw there's a little bit lower survival compared to the older groups, when the yearlings get kicked off of mom, they don't really know what to do and how to defend themselves, and they're just way more susceptible to bears at that time. So I think that's kind of what explains a lot of the bear mortality, is just yearlings freshly kicked off of mom, not really sure how to fend for themselves. So kind of wrapping up the research portion of this section of this presentation, we asked the question of if nutrition is limiting our 22C and D moose population. We looked at all those parameters of health. And to summarize them here, once again, we've got female moose are producing calves as early as 2. They're twinning as early as 3. Very highly reproductive potential here. Twinning rates are among the highest in the state at that 60%. So my answer to the question of nutrition is probably not. I don't think that nutrition is limiting us right now. So that means, like, I don't think there's too few willows. I don't think the willows are not nutritious enough. All of these things that we've seen leading up to this study suggest nutrition is not limiting. The question of predation is a little more nuanced, I think. So we've got that really high neonatal mortality, that early life mortality through the 6 weeks. But then we've got low yearling and then the young and adult, mature adult mortality, very low, virtually nothing after year 4. So even though there's really high mortality in the first 6 weeks, there's not a lot after that point. And then from that population, the 2 graphs I showed at the beginning, the population does appear to be growing. So I think predation is a little limiting, but I don't think it's necessarily keeping us stable. I think we are growing the moose population. So I took both of these questions. I looked at the metrics of reproduction and survival rates, and I was able to put them into a population model to see what the growth rate for our population is. And what I ended up finding is that we actually are growing at a rate of 6% annually. So even though it kind of seems like the moose are staying stable through time, the reproduction seems to be able to compensate for that high mortality. And then the high survival after that 6 weeks seems to really be working together to, like, let us increase, just not at a really high, fast rate. So just to put that into perspective here, I've got our graph from unit 22C and D again, just so we can recap what that looks like now that we've got all of this knowledge. Once again, you can see 22C and 22D kind of saw increases since the last time we did a survey. So from 2020 to 2023 in D, 2019 to 2022 in C. And then I'm just going to incorporate that 6% growth rate for my best guess of where I think the moose are now in the absence of us doing a population survey. And my guess is that now 22C is probably closer to 560 moose, which is above that management objective of, 450 to 550. And then in 22D, maybe closer to 1600 moose. So climbing, we're not really within that objective yet. But in theory, we are still going up. In 22C, we're above these objectives, and it seems like that's okay. Even though historically there's been some concerns about winter habitat, I think we have a lot more information now that tells us maybe we can let it growing and see. So that is my best guess about how the population's doing. As far as the next steps, we are going to get actual estimates, hopefully, as long as weather cooperates. We'll see with this ice and the weird weather that's the past few years have happened. But spring 2026, we're going to get back into C, and also 22B out to the east. And then 22D and E to the north we'll do the year after, so 2027. As far as future research, we still have about 100 moose that have collars. They're anywhere from 4 years old to 8 now, I think. So we're just gonna continue to follow them, continue to see how they're calving, doing browsing rates, those surveys that we can do with the sample that we've got, and keep measuring how things are going as the population continues to grow. As far as management, I have just been kind of keeping things slowly going and letting it grow. Like I said, we are above objectives right now in 22C, but it seems to be okay. So we are just going to continue monitoring those twinning rates, those browse removal, and if anything changes, we'll be able to react. But we're in a really good position, I think. So the moose population is increasing, it's increasing slowly, and I think that gives us a really good opportunity to measure how that population grows, if it has a negative impact on the health nutrition of the population. So finally, for the folks who are wondering, like, well, how does this affect my hunting regulations, and how many moose I can harvest or whatever, I have a final plug about how this all goes into the regulatory process. One of the cool things about Alaska is the public, anyone can submit a proposal to change any hunting regulation. So my role as Fish and Game is to simply comment on the biology. This is how many moose there are. This is how many moose I think you can take sustainably. So there's moose for everyone year after year after year. Whereas the public kind of has a role in the more nuanced parts of hunting, as far as, well, maybe we should have an antler restriction. Actually, I like it as any bull. I would like to have a winter season, a fall season that lasts 2 weeks, 2 days. That's really where the public comes into play and has a lot of say in submitting proposals. So if someone were to want to change any hunting regulations, a way that they can get involved is through the advisory committee. Charlie is here as the advisory committee chair for the local Northern Norton Sound advisory committee. And there actually is a subcommittee on moose meeting on March 4th at 4 p.m. if folks want to hear more about the moose population, and the public is welcome to get together to kind of.
Is that here?
That is here, yeah.
Northwest Campus.
Yeah, here at Northwest Campus, March 4th, 4 p.m., talking about moose, talking about our hunting regulations. So we're gonna get way more into that, I think, at that meeting. So I try to keep this light, but yeah, you can get active by attending those meetings, learning about the population some more, and we at Fish and Game are always available to help. So if anybody's ever curious about, hey, I would like to see this change in the moose hunting structure, that you're welcome to come by our office. We are there every day, 8 to 5, Monday through Friday. Love when people come by to just chat about moose, muskox, bears, anything. And we can help design proposals and even just kind of provide our biological opinion on stuff. So just kind of a plug there for the regulatory process with hunting. And at that, I think that might wrap things up. Yeah, so hopefully that kind of clarified and gave you the comprehensive view of all the research for moose in our area and how our moose are doing. And my contact information is there. Email me, call me, swing by the office, like I said, anytime, and we're more than happy to chat.
All right, we're a thin crowd here. We're clapping on.
Yeah.
We're a thin crowd because the Iron Dog halfway banquet is tonight. We didn't plan that one. We didn't see that one coming, but we're the Iron Dog, if you're not familiar, is a big snow machine race. So here we are, and you have plenty online. So honestly, wonderful presentation. For the Strait Science audience, this is the time. Look at that. Dan Reed's leading the way.
Uh-oh.
This is the time. This is the time to, it's never easy being a public speaker, and Sara did an awesome presentation on moose and all the research that's been going on and where they are. So this is the time to show her some love in the chat. So put down some good thoughts and comments there. And it looks like while you're thinking of your question, Dean Stockwell has several questions in the chat. So the first one is, and I don't know if you stop share,
Okay.
you might unless people wanna take your number down.
If I can chat.
No, just go to,
Oh,
yeah, there we go. The first one is there any way to estimate twin mortality rate where one calf doesn't make it?
yes, there is. So, yeah, thank you for your question, Dean. We actually do try to, there's two ways we can do that, I guess. So the first, with the collaring project, we always tried to collar both twins. And there were very few times that we couldn't find both of them, because sometimes one would lay down and we just couldn't find it. So we'd only color the one. But we did try to estimate when twins die, one or the other. It did generally seem like when one calf dies, the other one does as well, because moose tend to like to stay together, especially the twins. So the strategy of moose calves is to lay down and hide, especially when there's bears around, while mom, as you saw, does all the work of defending the calf against bears. But yeah, so generally we would see both calves die and they would be right next to each other. And I think a lot of times too, you would have sows with cubs, the bears that would come in on the moose calves. So mom could distract the mom, or mama sow could distract the mama moose, and the cubs could kind of just sniff out the calves, is what I have noticed in my experience. So that is kind of gives us a good idea, but generally twins do die together. We didn't always see that, but that is the general rule for twin mortality.
And he also has, compared to cattle twins, is there a certain natural mortality of twins? Is this very different in moose?
A certain natural mortality of twins.
I guess is the mortality rate of
compared
twins.
to like single moose, I assume is the question. I'm not sure.
Or is there a twinning? I might read that
That's
as.
how I take it. Is it
like twins
harder to,
versus single?
bring twins to the 6-week mark than a singleton?
Oh, we did look for differences between twin and singleton mortality, and we didn't really find a difference. I'm trying to think of, I don't know that that's been found in other studies. I'm trying to think right now.
I mean, when a bear finds you.
Yeah, it's kind of like,
It's kind of-
yeah, bears are really good at finding moose calves, and yeah, it seems like whether you're one or two.
And lastly, for Dean's questions, when you have other questions, is neonatal mortality influenced by nutrition?
That's a really good question too. Got lots of good questions. So that was actually one of the questions for my master's study, as I was trying to compare the health of the mother, which is why we only collared the newborn calves of collared moms. So I was trying to make inferences on if there was any relationship between a really healthy mom from when she was a calf. Generally, we're assuming they remain healthy calves or healthy moose throughout the rest of their life if they're a healthy calf. So we were trying to see if those well-performing adults would then have better survival of their calves, which we could make, that link between nutrition because of the weight. And we did not find any relationship between whether you're a fat calf or whether you're a fat mom, skinny mom, young mom, old mom. So it just did not see, it was completely random. So yeah, like calves that weighed like that really skinny one. There was others that were really tiny, really fat calves that were 50 pounds. We could barely lift them up with our spring scale. They all died all the same. There was no relationship. So it's the bears are just, they do not discriminate against healthy or not. So it's pretty interesting. It's one of the first studies I've seen that kind of compares. There's been like birth weight and survival, but I haven't seen any where it's just completely random, which I thought was pretty interesting.
So Q Ali asks, can browse rates collected over time differentiate changes in population size versus density?
It's a good question.
Are these people on your committee?
Conant is a coworker.
Oh, okay,
Like,
all right.
we can get into this, but we're gonna need like 45 minutes to discuss this
Okay.
topic. But the simple answer is yes, it can. differentiate changes in population size and density.
All right,
Yeah.
Q, and you're gonna get a little more discussion after.
Yeah, we'll talk at work
That
tomorrow.
sounds, yeah, you're gonna get it at work tomorrow.
Then 8 AM to 9 PM before they leave to fly for radio tracking.
There we go. So Sean Killian writes, and I see your hand, Dean, do you see an increase with resident and non-resident brown bear tags for 2025-26 to help with predation, to help with calf mortality, or is it still being observed?
Yeah, I think those changes, that's a good question, Sean. I think it's too soon to see any changes from that increase in permits. But it's definitely something that we're watching. So, yeah.
All right, and Dean, you have your hand raised. Go ahead.
Yeah, hi, Sarah. Thank you for the talk. Really enjoyed it. Coming up from Texas, I've been influenced by a lot of people that have raised cattle. And my questions about the twins kind of emanate from that in the sense that cattle will have twins. Basically, one dies and one survives. But you have no way to estimate that because you were saying that basically when you find them, both twins are dead. And, you know, that's, I just wanted you to know where that's coming from. Looking into the cattle literature, you might get some information about twin mortality that you can use for the moose.
Oh, that's really interesting. Yeah, I'll have to look into that. Thank you.
Thank you, Dean.
You bet.
All right. Any other questions? Well, we've got questions right in here. And I have to say, there's online, we have a phone caller. So the caller, I didn't see that, has priority. So at any time, just unmute or unmute and bust right in, because it's hard to be on your phone and you can't raise your hand, you can't be seen, things like that. So while you're allowed to bust in on us, we'll go right here in the room. There's 2 hands up. Go ahead, Art.
Okay. So in the first slides, you had identified those harsh winter years. Are there any years of your study that you would consider to be a harsh winter?
Yeah, that's an interesting question. I think it's very hard to quantify severity in winter, especially because, here's my plug, National Weather Service is no longer measuring snow depth data at the airport. So we usually, when you look at winter severity, you need to know that snow depth, and we just don't have that information. There's some automated systems that are called SnowTel, if you're familiar with them, through NRCS. There's one that just went up at Pilgrim. There's one in Quartz Creek, I think, to Charlie, and then there's another one at Rocky Point and anyway, none of them are close to Nome. So yeah, so when the Weather Service stopped doing the snow data, it was perfectly when we started this study. So I couldn't really get a good metric to compare to those years in the 70s when they said that there was really heavy snow. But what we can look at, and what Warren did for folks who are familiar with him, is he looked at the weight loss between the fall and the spring, and he just tried to figure out what happens is moose are really heavy in the fall time. They've got all that summer nutrition kind of helping them, and then the idea is you lose a lot of weight over the summer or over the winter into the spring by the time most people are measuring in the spring. And it just seemed like they lost weight, but it was still really healthy. So we don't really have a good metric of winter severity to compare with that. And it seemed like their metric was just moose dying in droves is what the reports say, is they just find tons of dead moose. And
And how would you characterize that mortality? Is that a natural mortality? And is it due to not being able to browse, or what would you characterize harsh winter mortality as?
Yeah, generally the biggest group that's getting hit by severe winters is calves. So because moose are tall creatures, so as adults they can get through pretty much anything. And the idea is a moose in the winter isn't really moving around that much, so they're up in their fall rutting habitat and those higher headwater areas. And once there's enough snow, it kind of pushes them down, and they stay in those main stems of the rivers, like you saw Alicia and those willows. And that's the stuff they're really hitting heavily. But the calves, once there's that really deep snow that's even in those river beds, then they can't really move as well. They're using a lot of energy to get around, and they're the ones that are dying. So that's why we look at calf weights and stuff, because usually what you'll see is those really unhealthy calves. They weigh less than that 385 pounds. You can see their hip bones. And we do see that with the adults sometimes, where you can see their hips, and it just doesn't seem like they just seem they're so healthy from the fall. The summers are so good for them here that they can just go into winter and weather pretty much anything. So it's pretty nice to see.
Have you thought about the big caterpillar infestations that killed a bunch of willows a couple of years ago? Happened several years in a row, and then I wanted to comment that those heavy snow years in the 80s were the moose teeth were crazed with just broken off and just on the verge of breaking in a terrible way, and they were down to eating broom handle size sticks because they couldn't, only the felt leaf willows stuck up above the snow.
Yeah.
So there were several years there when the moose teeth were just terrible. And at the time, the conversation was, is this due to nutrition in terms of minerals? Or is it due to chewing on too big of objects?
Mechanical.
Mechanical. So that was, but I think that would be a red flag. If you start seeing moose teeth that are busted, that's
For sure.
a proof.
Yeah.
Anyway, but yeah, we see some of the forage getting decimated, and then conversely, we see more and more cottonwoods. And I wondered if you had any observations there.
Yeah. No, it's a good question. And actually, when the rusty tussock caterpillar, I think they were called, when that was like really happening there, we had some pretty serious concerns, because like by Banner Creek, you could see those huge swaths of dead willows, and it seemed like that was only like a 2-year thing, and it didn't happen again. And I almost view it as like a habitat resetting event. Like, you know, in the interior, you've got ice scouring from like breakup, which will plow down all those willows, and then they grow again, and that creates moose habitat, or there's fires that create it. And we don't really get a lot of that. So the concern is that there's just like old willows that aren't very nutritious. So I wonder if the caterpillars killing these willows may actually be doing them a favor, especially if it's only a 2-year event. But if it did continue to happen, I think it would, when you're killing these huge swaths of willows, it would be a bigger deal. But they didn't seem to affect them. When we did the browse, I didn't see any like dead willows necessarily, like huge swaths of dead willows.
There was very few that were even 50% dead.
Yeah.
Most of them were
Nothing was just
less than
outright
50%.
Yeah.
And it was impressive. It was good.
They were heavily I mean, they were browsed, but they just obviously not as much as would affect the population. So, but yeah, nothing had died.
Yeah, didn't seem like the caterpillars helped the ptarmigan much
No.
when we
Yeah.
seemed to have very few.
Sure seems to be
ptarmigan.
plenty of ptarmigan now too.
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
yeah.
So I think, let's see, with an estimated increase of 6% in the moose population annually, what percentage increase would concern you in impacting the browse? Thanks, Justin.
Yeah, that's a good question. And I think, yeah, it's kind of the underlying question of this whole study is how many moose can we handle? And I think that's why I'm actually kind of happy with this 6% kind of slowly increasing us, because it gives us the opportunity to measure at a rate where, you know, if you had double that, a 12% annual increase, it would be very hard to react if something, you know, all of a sudden you were to see that browse removal rate suddenly increase up to the 20s, maybe into the 30s, where you're starting to get concerned. I think we're at a really good point where we're allowing for slow increase so we can detect changes. So yeah, I think as far as a percentage for browse, or what percent growth would concern me, I'm not really sure. And that was, like Charlie was saying, like whether it was a winter removal issue with the broken teeth, or I think there was like a selenium deficiency back in the day too. What was the actual concern for those unhealthy moose? If it was the consecutive severe winters, was it browse? We don't think it was browse now. So there's still some questions, but I think we're at a good point where there's this, slight enough increase that we can monitor it and react when something does seem to be changing in that browse removal or the twitting rates. I think we're in a good place.
All right, well, my question is, I guess we should anticipate fat moose this year.
Yes.
Is that right?
Yes.
And I know we're highly variable right now with our weather pattern, but overall, it seems like it's not, at least in the last 5 years, I didn't see anything that was like, a detriment to, and that, by that I mean, I would worry we're getting these icing events where we're
Yeah.
getting that
Mhm.
heavy icing, but I guess that our weather changes now, back up again or back down again, that maybe that doesn't have any effect. So you make me really happy on this talk, because if you listen more to the marine side of the house, it's nice to hear that our moose are doing well
Yeah.
and that we're on the increase, and that the climate and ecology is helping them and not hindering them.
Yeah.
We'll have to have a conversation with the bear population, but that seems to be a different one. And I think, Dean, is your hand raised still, or?
Yes, it
Or
is.
Okay, go for it. I see that.
Yeah, I've been listening to this, and you have a complicated system here with a lot of competition. You have caribou, you have musk oxen, all kind of using the same territory as your moose. And is there any way in your models that you can estimate the various competition between all of these groups, focusing on willow, perhaps, as you say?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. And I also think that these animals have a really good way of separating themselves in these habitats, even though it seems like they are all in the same area, like just their habits, like moose like to be in the water, willows, whereas muskox you might expect to be up in the higher areas, especially in the wintertime, they're up on mountaintops. Sometimes they all eat willows. But caribou, they prefer lichen in the winter, whereas moose are eating that woody browse. Muskox are eating kind of forbs, cranberries on mountaintops. I just think they have a really good way of spatially separating that it's not really as much of an issue. And then especially the last several years, caribou have not really come out onto that Seward Peninsula in great numbers like those years in the before 2017, when there were 80,000 caribou from the Western Arctic herd here. We don't really see that. I mean, there may be a few thousand here now, but I don't think that it's enough to really have a lot of competition. And yeah, it seems like in my experience, muskox and moose generally are always in different areas, and don't really interact with each other. Muskox eat kind of pretty much anything they can get their hands on. So where moose are very specialists with whether it's that vegetation, greens, the forbs, flowers in the summer, and the woody browse in the winter. But yeah.
Hi, Austin. I see you got your hand raised. Go ahead. Thank
Yeah, I
you.
think, yeah, thanks. Great presentation. I guess from the hunter's perspective, all is not well. A lot of us consider the Nome area to have some of the worst moose hunting regulations. My question is, we've over harvested for a long time, well over a decade. We've never under harvested. Do you have an opinion about the impact of human over harvest for well over a decade?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think I definitely encourage you to come to the Moose Subcommittee meeting on March 4th, because I think that'll be a great conversation specific to this. But we can monitor a lot of over harvest through what we look at our bull cow ratios. So how many bulls we have compared to the number of cows. And we actually have had really good bull ratios in this area over the last 10 years. And I will bring all of that information to the subcommittee, and if you can attend, I can send that information to you. So we've actually been really conservatively harvesting bulls, especially in 22C since 2012. And I think you would see, like, we had these really low bull numbers before then, where it was only, something like 10 bulls per 100 cows. But now what we're seeing is 30 bulls per 100 cows, which is a really great number in comparison. So I do think that we're going in the right direction, which is really nice to see, where there's more moose and now there's more bulls. And I think these things are probably contributing to what you're seeing, is just kind of this chronic 2-day hunt. There's just so much going on in 22C, especially, where it's just like lots of bulls and lots of moose and more moose every year. It's just hunters can find them in 2 days. And whether some people think that that's, representative of overharvest, we just don't see it in our bulls. We're just seeing plenty of bulls still. So I do think the subcommittee is really going to auger in on that stuff for sure, though. Yeah.
So what time does that, Austin, does that answer your question before I?
Yeah, I guess that I don't know if that plays true for historic harvests. Yeah, I mean, we'd have to get into the history of it all, but currently, yes, because the population appears to be growing. Yes, they're easier to find. Perhaps now you could argue that, but that might not play for 10 years ago, when C still had a really limited season.
Yeah.
So it sounds like, from what I can gather in hearing, March 4th is a Tuesday. What time does that meeting start?
4 p.m.
4 p.m. It's right here at UAF, Northwest Campus main building, in this room, the Gosrick Conference Room. So Tuesdays.
Zoom too, right?
Yeah, it will be.
Oh, it
on
will be on Zoom?
Yep.
Okay.
You can
And
email me and I'll give you the info if you're looking to attend remotely.
do you guys put anything in the Nome Nugget or Facebook or anything? Nome now?
I can share it on Nome Post, Nome Announce closer to the date. For
Yeah,
sure.
that would be
I don't know about Nome
great.
Nugget. Yeah.
So thank you for that. We're at the 7:30 mark. And for next week, Straight Science will meet on Thursday, the 27th. And we're going back to the ocean on this one. We've got Jim Murphy with NOAA Alaska Fisheries Science Center, and he will be giving the results for the 2024 Surface Trawl Survey of the Northern Bering Sea. So that would be an interesting one for me, and for hopefully for everyone on board tonight. And I think that wraps it up. Thank you so much, Sarah. Great presentation. Thank
everybody.
you all for attending. Both in and online. We'll see you next time. Thank you so much. Have a good night.